Welcome back to my channel. I'm your host, Steven. Today's episode is talking about cracks and how they can occur on a clarinet, what to do to try to prevent them, and how some of them can occur. So don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, like, and share afterwards. So let's start learning about how to prevent cracks on your clarinet, some of the easy ways of doing it. What we're going to do first is look at my webpage real quickly, as I do have a page about cracks and cracking. And here we go right now. Of course, making it funny here, I said, why do clarinets crack? It's because you stare at them. Anyways, normally what occurs when clarinets crack is that there's some type of temperature change, drastic temperature change, especially when you play it. Of course, if you go to different humidities, for instance, if you go from one continent to another and there's gigantic humidity changes and then you play them, that could also make them crack too. But right now, we're just going to talk about temperature changes. So what I did here on this one clarinet is, if you use a heat gun where you can control the temperature, you can make items crack on wood. Now, you know wood is made of, now you know when wood grows, it grows from the center on out, and it has rings in it. Even grenadilla has rings in it. It's very, very dense, and you can't really see it, but it does. And another thing you have to remember is, a lot of clarinet joints are not the perfect center of a branch or part of a tree, and the rings themselves aren't perfectly round going across the entire clarinet. In fact, the clarinet may be going across a piece of wood versus kind of straight up through it. All depends on how it's cut and how many pieces of wood they can maximize out of a branch or a trunk or whatever it may be. So the piece of wood of the clarinet can expand not just concentrically, but can expand more in one direction than another. And this is the reason clarinets kind of crack in certain areas that you can't really see because you don't know how the wood is prepared, how it came from, whatever. Now, we are going to have another episode too about seeing what the manufacturers do to prepare the wood to cut them, because we know they dry them. In the old days, they dried them by putting them outside for 15 years or whatever. Modern methods is they put in these big dryers, then they put in these big bins where they basically, it's a pressure cooker, and it pushes linseed oil or whatever oil they may use into the wood itself to prepare it to make it more stable. And then they start manufacturing on it. And we'll see those in a later episode. But right now, here's an example I want to show you where I'm using a heat gun down the bore of a clarinet, and I'm increasing the inside bore temperature quicker than the outside temperature is increasing. Of course, this is like breathing through the clarinet itself. You know, our temperature is 98 degrees Fahrenheit as we're breathing out. And the outside temperature of the clarinet could be, well, it depends. If you had it in the car, it could be 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 40, is it wintertime, 20, whatever. And we'll see here on this first one, there's a crack. I know where the crack's at, and it's basically just to the right of the middle of this register pad cup, going from right to left. You can barely see it here. And as I would increase the temperature of the internal bore expands more because it's warming up more than the outside of the clarinet. Now, when you take wood and you put it in a cold environment, it shrinks a little bit. And the trouble is you have all the layers of the wood being cold and shrinking if it's in your car overnight. And if you start playing on it, you still have the outside layers of the wood being compressed, but now you're playing through it, the inside gets warmed up and it starts expanding. So now you have this tug of war of an expanding inside and a compressing inside, and at some point, the expansion is going to be too much pressure for the outside. And remember, the outside is warming up by being inside, but not as fast as it is on the inside you playing it. The second picture, there's still no crack. Third picture, still no crack. Now the instrument's warmed up and boom, this crack opens up. Of course, any crack going through a tone hole is going to open up also, which is going to be a leak going through that tone hole. And this is the problem people have where they say the clarinet plays fine, then 10 minutes later it just doesn't play anymore. Because when the instrument warms up, the wood will expand and cracks will open at basically, I always use the term at 10 minutes. It seems to be around 10 minutes, depending upon how much you play. And this is why clarinets can play really good for a while, and then all of a sudden they can't play anymore. And then you stop playing for a bit. And when you stop playing for a bit, the inside board cools off and shrinks a bit. Everything shrinks a bit. The leak disappears. You start playing again, it plays fine. You play for another 5-10 minutes, and all of a sudden it stops playing again. And this is an indication of a crack somewhere in your clarinet. And this example shows you here. I have on here the instrument was leak free before it warms up. And this is a problem that the player was having. It would play fine for about 10 minutes and stop playing. Then something would happen, the leak would happen. They didn't know what was going on. They would stop playing, start playing again. It'll play fine. Once again, it warms up, crack opens up, stops playing well. And this is a good example of a crack coming and going. And this is easily demonstratable and easily repeatable. You simply cool down an instrument and you put a heat gun through it, and you can control the temperature. And like I said, the inside expands. Let's take a quick diagram of what this looks like. Okay, on this quick diagram, I have the top part. We have the instrument outside and inside is at a stable temperature. If it's stored in your car, it could be 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 30, 20, depends upon the temperature outside in the fall, winter, or spring. Then you take it inside to go have band practice or whatever. And when you start playing, the outside temperature of the clarinet will slowly rise to room temperature, but slowly. It could go from 40 to slowly up to 50, whatever. But the internal temperature from you starting to play it, that's your internal body temperature going through the bore of the clarinet. And the inside, as you see here in pink on the second diagram here, is now expanding as the outside is still cool and still compressed a bit. And this inside is now putting pressure on the outside. In the third diagram, we see now the bore temperature continues to heat up quickly. The inner bore now is warmer than ever. The middle section is expanding some more, and the outer is still cool, much more cooler than the inside of the temperature. And at some point, when the internal pressure of expanding is more pressure than the compression of the outside of the bore, you'll just get a snap and it'll crack. This is why you hear many times someone says, you know, put the clarinet barrel and upper joint underneath your arm to warm up the outside of the clarinet itself. There's many solutions to that. Next, we have a 1956 documentation of clarinets and cracks. We're going to take a look at it real quickly. This here says a crack affects, we're on the right column. This here says a crack affects the playing qualities of an instrument only when it goes completely through to the bore. And the bore also includes the tone holes, by the way. This causes a leak the same as when a pad does not seat properly. There are several precautions which should be taken to lessen the likelihood of cracking. The clarinet should be given a light coat of bore oil periodically to prevent moisture from soaking into the wood fibers of the bore. At the end of this video, I have a link to how to identify when to oil the bore of your clarinet. This goes on saying clarinet should be given light coat of bore oil to prevent moisture from soaking into the wood fibers of the bore. And that's what oil is for. The oil is to make sure that water doesn't get into the bore. Because when water gets cold and say turns to ice, it expands. And we don't want that. The oil is there because it's much more stable over larger temperatures than the water. And in here, it says many authorities believe this moisture causes the wood fibers on the inside to expand. Since the outside clarinet has not expanded, it cracks to relieve the inner pressure. It is most important that a new clarinet or one that has been allowed to dry out be broken in by playing it only for short periods of time. Moisture, of course, always has a tendency to settle in the tenon sockets and always dry those out. And special attention should be paid to drying these. Cracking is also caused by sudden temperature changes. Perhaps the most common cause is playing on a cold instrument, the one example I just gave. The warm breath makes the bore of the clarinet expand rapidly, while the outside of the clarinet is still contracted, and a crack develops when the pressure of the inside basically is greater than the pressure of the outside. It relieves by a crack occurring. Then it talks about case covers. I don't really understand that, because if it's sitting in your car, the entire instrument and inside of the case is going to reduce in overall temperature anyways. the case cover is an insulator, but the clarinet in the case doesn't create heat on its own. So I'm not quite sure where that comes from. This is 1956, by the way. So really, as we see here in my first example, is this crack opened up because the inside of the bore was much more warmer than the outside temperature of the outer layers of the clarinet. Now, as I mentioned, you don't know where it's going to crack because the clarinet itself is not cut right down the center of the branch. And anyways, when we look at the type of wood in the future and how to identify what type of wood you have, you'll see that African blackwood isn't a cylindrical branch. It's quite warped in a way. So there is no center. And the rings aren't concentric, they're maybe shifted off to the side. So there may be more pressure in one area, and all depends upon how it's cut. But basically, this crack would disappear once the inside of the bore, you stop playing a bit and it cools off and it contracts back a bit, where this crack will then disappear again. This is another article from Caravan Instruments. See Robert Schulenberg. I forgot what year this was. This was Music Editor's Journal, 1940, September 1940. Now this one says humidity is the reason for cracks in wood instruments. The air, when dry, has the tendency to absorb moisture from any place it can. And that's true. In my workshop, I have humidifiers here, and I try to keep the humidity at 40% or higher anytime I work on wood instruments, or anytime I do, even when I did create wood bowls and candlesticks, things out of wood, woodworking stuff, I will keep the humidity higher in here because I don't want anything to happen to the wood. You want the wood to be nice and stable. Anyways, it goes on, the air when dry has a tendency to absorb moisture from any place it can. For instance, in the wintertime right now in Michigan, with the cold air, the humidity in the house drops down to 20% or less. And I have humidifiers that actually, not part of the furnace system, but just sitting around, pushing the water back into the air. It's a losing effort, but trouble is when humidity gets below 35%, you start getting static electricity in about everything. So I always tend to try to keep humidity as high as possible, up to about 40% if I can. Anyways, this goes on to say, and when the dry air absorbs the moisture from the wood shrinks. This is another reason you use oil, and you want to oil your clarinet, not just the bore, but also the outside. You don't have to do much, just a little bit here and there on the outside, because when it absorbs it, it'll dissipate into the rest of the clarinet too, or like that. Because of the thickness of the wood of the clarinet, it cannot expand and shrink evenly. The pressure exerted by the inner wood causes the outer wood to crack, and excessive pressure may cause the crack to extend through to the bore. So this is an example, like say you go from a humid environment, so you live in Brazil or even the west coast of the US or even Australia, and you go to some area like say the inner parts of China, which are much drier. They have a different humidity pattern than other parts of the world, and just like going to a desert, you can get the same problem, and just by going to a different part of the world, your clarinet can crack too. This goes and says the pressure exerted by the inner wood causes the outer wood to crack. The excessive pressure may cause the crack to extend through the bore. Thus, one is inviting trouble when he puts an instrument away wet. That's why you always want to dry your instrument and also dry the sockets too. If a wood instrument could be kept in an atmosphere of even humidity, there'd be little danger of cracking. Even humidity and even temperature, I should say. A humidity gauge would be a valuable gadget to have in band rooms. During winter months in rooms that are artificially heated, there's the greatest danger. That's it. Gas heat is very dry, and it just sucks the moisture out of the air. So it says such rooms should be kept at a relative humidity of about 50 degrees. Too much moisture may cause springs to rust and wood to crack when drying begins. Instruments that are used in a damp atmosphere or at night football games, etc., should be warmed with the hands before blowing and dried thoroughly both on the inside and outside after using. Repairing cracks is an expensive job. And, if crack repair isn't done right, fixing that crack repair is somewhat difficult, or maybe difficult depending upon how the first one is fixed or attempted to be fixed. This is one reason to learn to play a brass instrument and play the brass instrument in marching band. You don't have to worry about that. Anyways, those are a couple of examples of how cracks can occur on a clarinet. I hope the information helped you to understand why your clarinet can crack, both when playing it when it's cold or going to other areas of the country or internationally. I want to thank you for listening today. Any questions or comments, please post them down below. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. You gotta love knowledge, gotta love life, gotta love clarinets as long as you don't crack them, right? We'll see you next time.